as we prepare for our next panel, which Deborah has foreshadowed, actually. It's going to be called Accelerating Sustainable Transformation in Food Value Chains. So you have foreshadowed it a minute ago. I have to tell you a few things. First, the GICC has 70 member institutions around the world in 35 countries. And I want to talk about the GICC and Excelencia for a minute. We have the GICC creating, following with material like best practices in competitive strategy and global, and of course sharing the global competitive principles, come and become a part, they become real in Argentina through, for example, initiatives like the National Innovation Management Quality Prize that will, for the first time, be fully recognized and pushed by the whole government and the country. And of course, there's another part of these principles that we will see in the National Board Management Award that, of course, goes to corporate governance, always an interesting and attractive issue in countries like Argentina. I want to confirm, Natalia, that we're ready to go. Want to confirm? Okay. And one final point before we move on is, as we discuss different issues globally, what Excelencia is trying to do here is bring them to a local, real country where the situation has to be changed, improved, and these principles have to be made operational, made to operate. And these are two of the initiatives I'm sharing with you. Throughout the event, I will slowly, and in these little breaks, share a few more of the initiatives and the work that's really being done here in Argentina, as well as the cooperation between Argentina and the GFCC. The next panel we're going to have is Accelerating Sustainable Transformation in Food Value Chains. As I said, Deborah already foreshadowed a little bit of that in her comments, but before further ado, I want to invite to the stage Mr. Santiago Murtagh. He's the president of Excelencia Foundation and CEO of Culligan Water. He's been presiding Excelencia for 3 years. I will tell you a few facts about him in upcoming introductions. Very interesting chap for a good talk. My panelists now will be Adolfo Ruizón from Rosario, a city I grew up in, and actually members of your family who I know. So welcome on stage, Adolfo. And my next panelist, he's president of Congelados del Sur, a food company. We'll learn a lot more about it in this panel. Juan Garibaldi, regional vice president, Waters Latin America in Danone. Mr. Garibaldi, welcome on stage. Take a seat, go ahead. Oh, sorry, that was extremely impolite of me. Paul Levins, Chief Strategy Officer at Shinova. Mr. Levins, welcome on stage.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Suresh Garimela, Executive Vice President for Research and Partnerships at Purdue University. I invite you to a seat.
Thank you,
Mr. Murtagh.
Thank you so much, Diego. I'll do it from here. Thank you so much, gentlemen, to join us in this conversation. We're very excited about this panel because I really think it is extremely diverse. We have on the one side experts from Purdue University, from Shinova, and then on the other side we have business, right? Not only the big multinational business like Danone, but also we have an entrepreneurial, young, and very energetic company like Congelados del Sur. So it is right, Deborah really started the conversation about the future of food, and we know that we have the capacity of feeding 10 billion people now, but somehow we have 700 million people dying of hunger. So obviously we have a huge challenge in terms of distributing that food. But a lot of technologies are popping up and are coming. And somebody, I mean, there is some sort of consensus that we are in front of a fourth revolution. The first food revolution was the agricultural revolution. 10,000 years ago, agriculture not only triggered a different mean of surviving, but also permitted the establishment of cities, and after the cities, it came the money, and after the money, it came the writing, right? So that was a big one. Then it came the second food revolution, and it was at the same time of the industrial revolution. It was 300 years ago, and mostly it used all the technological means and mechanization that the industrial revolution brought to the world and to humankind. So then we faced the third revolution. It was also called the Green Revolution. It happened in 1970, and it really prevented 1 billion people of dying of starvation, mostly in India. Norman Borlaug and his team basically made the advancements in techniques and genetics that really let us increase yields up to 3 times what they used to be. And now we are in the phase of this fourth revolution. So the question to the panel is this really a fourth revolution, or is it going to be incremental improvements, piggybacking over all this technological disruption that we are seeing? So what do you think? Gentlemen, who would like to pick up the tab first?
Yeah, I'll kick off, okay. Santiago. Look, I don't think we've got the luxury of incrementalism. So is there going to be a fourth revolution? Well, I think there has to be. Right? Is there a fourth revolution? Yes. There has to be. But I think we need to distinguish innovation from access to innovation. Right? Right at this moment, there are 500 million small farms in the world. 500 million small farms. They produce 80% of the food that's consumed in the world. 80%. And the vast majority of those, something like 80% of the 80%, are working the same way as they've always worked. No real distributed access to clean water, no understanding of what's happening in the market by way of demand. And so what we also know is that there's all sorts of technology that they could access right now that would make massive improvements to the yield. And so I think there's, I'd make those 2 points as an introduction, and then I'll stop and let others. Yes, we can't afford the luxury of incrementalism. There has to be a revolution. We have to be urgent in that revolution. But at the same time, we shouldn't think that we have to rely on some new technology. We certainly have to do that, but we also have to make use of the technologies that already exist and provide access for people to those technologies.
Thank you, Paul. Suresh?
Santiago, I would add a perspective from our university where we hold a Norman Borlaug summer program for people from around the world to come and spend several weeks at Purdue to learn about agricultural technologies. In fact, Norman Borlaug's daughter comes and presents at this event. So we have 3 World Food Prize winners at Purdue. They care a lot about scale and access, as Paul already said. So I think the ingredients of a fourth revolution, the ingredients of feeding 35% more people by 2050 are there. But it's a question of uptake. It's a question of whether the right technologies for the right regions are implemented. And it has so much to do with non-technological factors, just the political climate sometimes. The adoption of technology can be different. And so the way we see it is that there's a convergence of agriculture, engineering, technology. So I think on the side of improved technologies, we're increasingly seeing a blurring between what used to be considered just agriculture and engineering and data science and technology and so on. But it's a combination of all of those that can be brought to bear. But whether, to your specific question, whether it becomes a revolution or not depends on whether it's picked up by those that need to participate and make that revolution happen. I do believe that the technological resources are there. I think even something that you couldn't do 2 years ago, you can do today. There's been an enormous pace of technological change, but unless those technologies are implemented appropriately and scaled up, little boutique anecdotal experiments are okay, and often we celebrate them, we read papers about them, but unless they're scaled up, I don't think we're getting anywhere. And so actually next week, we have a conference called Scale Up Conference at Purdue, and we're developing a toolkit out of it that'll be available to the world, and I look forward to talking to you further about the technologies as well.
Thank you.
I do believe that we are entering into a new food revolution, not because the technology itself, but because the way technology will affect everybody here in our daily lives. So as you mentioned the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't because only the steam engine itself. It was because, thanks to that, manual processes were outsourced to machines, and that made a tremendous shift from the farm to the cities, and society itself evolved as never before. So technology today, I've seen the last 20 years, a lot of new technology, but the last 7 to 5 years, how this technology is impacting in our daily lives, thanks to this, and many services that are delivering through them, and people is changing. So we're seeing a change in our behaviors, and food, inevitably, value chain in the food would be affected sooner or later in every single step from the downstream to the upstream of the value chain. So I believe if we are not sensitive to understand that shift and how consumers are changing their behavior and their values in the next decades, we will be probably ending being out of the market, because the companies that really understand that will be the ones that will survive and will be able to serve the new consumers.
Thank you.
Hello.
Juan.
Particularly, I'm concerned about what is expected as a fourth revolution, as a fourth revolution. And in theory, it could be considered because of several factors, changes in technologies and so on, but I don't think that we are getting into the food revolution. And my takeaway is the next. From the production standpoint, it's being produced 30% more than is consumed. So in some way, there is a non-sustainable use of resources nowadays. So the resources that we are using is not in a sustainable way because we're using 30% more than is required for the consumers. From the production standpoint, my answer is no. From the distribution standpoint, while you see people that has a lot of food to eat, a lot of people also are living with some scarcity of resources. So at the end of the day, the unequitable use of resources also, it cannot consider part of the revolution. And from the consumption standpoint, while it's a necessary condition to be fed, it's not enough, because just as an example, the obesity or the way we're using the resources for food on an improper way, meaning bringing obesity to the population, which is a highly concern for people and for the health authorities. I believe that in the three of them are giving us some examples that the food revolution is not coming yet. On the other hand, from the consumer standpoint, yes, people realize that they cannot live with unsustainable use of resources, with an equitable way of distributing the resources, and with an unhealthy way of consuming. That's why the consumer good industry in general is exhausted, and now the consumers are leaving the typical consumer good industries because they're looking for much better alternatives, much more sustainable, much healthier, and in some way, in a different way that have been tackled in the past. So from the consumer standpoint, they are requesting, yelling that it's necessary having a revolution, but the producers still only are raising the bar from the technological perspective, but in my perspective, it's not enough.
So I'm kind of tempted not to move into the next question because I heard something totally different from Paul's side, right? You mentioned the urgency of changing, right? And just Juan made the point.
Sorry, to me or to Juan? Did you
No,
say?
no, no. I mean to you, Paul. I mean just Juan made the point like the only section of the revolution that we should be considered is the part of the revolution from the consumer point of view, right?
Yes, I think what I'm saying, I don't think the points are irresolvable, right?
Yeah.
They're not different. One of the things I think I'm picking up on that Juan is saying is that, you know, we have to help companies innovate, right? Yeah. To be able to, so they're capable of doing it themselves, but we also have to help them absorb the risk and be able to innovate for things like improvements in trust in the supply chain. So a big piece around waste isn't just that we throw things away, yeah. It's that we don't trust the food source. Huh? And so we need, that goes to things like tagging and tracking and provenance, yep. Right? How, you know, where the food has come from, what the quality was, how you protect the food quality in the supply chain. And I think that's the sort of point that I was trying to yep. make, was that there are some, I won't say they're simple, but there are some relatively straightforward things that can be done to be able to improve food security and food supply yep. and food quality.
Yeah, thank you. So the one thing which is obvious, like things are changing and they are changing fast, and technology is changing fast, right? So which would be the most relevant advances in AgTech? And these opportunities are driven mainly through products or through processes? Which are the areas which need to change the most? Which are the bottlenecks of the value chain which is basically extremely expensive and almost and terribly inefficient?
Santiago, I would say that, again, today there are choices available in technology, and it's ag tech, but it's technology writ large. And I would say perhaps that there are three sort of categories in terms of digital agriculture and data science that become quite critical. Certainly artificial intelligence. You know, some of these things seem like sort of technologies of the future, but AI can offer real-time support for decision-making in agriculture. And I think that's often one of the sort of shortcomings of how data is used. It's not used in real time, and also for environmental monitoring and such. The other one is in machine learning. And so this, again, it's a question of adapting the technologies to varying landscapes. You know, we've talked about a revolution, et cetera, but you know, every country is different, every sub-region in a country is different, and you do need to adapt the solutions. The markets are different, the access to markets are different, the transportation is different, et cetera, and therefore, machine learning can offer how one sustainably deals with different landscapes. For example, using the right amount of nutrient or chemical in the right spot and things like that, while protecting streams and such. And the third one, I would say, is data management and analytics. To some extent, all three are related. They're in the broad area of data science. I think the ability to I mean, lots of people take images, right, of plants and things like this. There's phenotypic imaging that's getting more widespread. But integrating that and developing analytics that enable sort of real-time decision-making from the data that you get and the images that you receive is possible today. It doesn't need huge compute space and things like that. And therefore, I think that these are no longer sort of boutique technologies for the future. It's a question of adapting them to the right markets, the right regional conditions, but the technology is ready.
Sort of what Adolfo said about like what happened in the third revolution, right? Which would be your take on that, Paul?
Oh, sorry, what on
On this question, yes.
Yeah, look, I'd go back to something I said yesterday, actually, in a forum we were at a meeting before at a summit. That innovation is not an outcome, right? Innovation is not an outcome. So we really have to focus, I think. One of the great things about the UN goals, sustainability goals, is that they have given us a focus, right? We want to end hunger by 2030. But at the moment, it's an aspiration as opposed to a compulsion, something that industry is necessarily focused on as a goal, something that governments are necessarily focused on as a goal. I think really we need at both regional and at sort of corporate levels a buy-in to that goal. And that's tricky, right, for organisations, for particularly multinational corporations, because they've got to make profit. They've got to make money to stay alive. So you need to provide the right incentives and the right, I suppose, goal setting from a regional point of view to be able to let them meet that goal.
Thank you. Juan, Adolfo?
I do have one comment, and I agree with Paul's comment about the role of the companies. And let me go back just for a minute and answer your question. You said if it's a process or product. And I believe it's a system, which includes process and product, but there's one more important thing, which is the behavior. Because what is the behavior? It is the way we tackle the process and the way we tackle and we develop the products. One quick comment, which is in the title, is a sustainable way of doing business. Of course, the companies, and especially the big companies, there are big mammoths trying to move as fast as possible and in a fast environment change, which I believe in some way the role we have is the profit, no doubt, but it's not only the what, but I think it's important the behavior, which is the how. Yep. That's why, in particular, Danone has been certified as a B Corp. And what is the being B Corp means to? It's not only make profit, but it's the way we do profit in a sustainable way with some social limits. Because at the end of the day, if we don't think that we need to go beyond the profit, thinking to develop the business for the next 30 years, a business that I will not see, because at that time I hope to be retired at that time. So in some way we need to build the business to ensure that we are going to do it in a sustainable way. And that's why the social agenda and the sustainability agenda need to be part of the behavior and mandates coupled with the product and the process per se. So it's not at any point to do the business. It's with certain limits that maybe the governments are not taking those limits today. And we need to, in some way, to do our limits by ourselves, put the limits by ourselves. Because if not, we will not have a business in the future. So that's the part of the trick of the sustainability, which is we need to do something in order to behave properly, to have a sustainable business in the future.
And a holistic approach. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Adolfo?
I basically believe that product innovation, it's been always on the agenda. I think companies have been innovating in products very often. The particularity that I see nowadays is that, as you mentioned before, Santiago, innovation happens at a much faster speed than ever before. On the other hand, innovation through processes or process innovations probably are much more deeper and has much more deeper impact on our lives and on our value chain. And I believe that we are seeing very deep innovations nowadays in processes thanks to new technology that is being accessible at an incredible affordable cost that in the past that would be a huge barrier or only selected for big companies. So.
Thank you. So we can move to the third questions, and I would be taking questions from the audience if you send them to my iPad. Thank you. So we talk a lot about the value chain and the complexity of the value chain because it has many stakeholders involved in that, going from farmers all the way down to consumers, right? And there are a lot of opportunities, and there is a sense of urgency that we have to act upon those opportunities based on this amazing technology that it is permeating the whole value chain. So which are the most important opportunities we can detect in order to, number one, take down costs, number two, connect the consumer to the real source of food, and really just take, give some meaning on the food chain, which is not only to bring in calories, but also nutrients and a healthy diet.
I can start
Sure.
if you want. I would prefer to focus from the value chain on the downstream aspect, from value-added processing to the end consumer. I foresee tremendous areas of opportunities there. Definitely, technology nowadays is a game changer. Why? Because it dramatically reduces the cost of matching buyers and sellers. Something that in the past was much more expensive and difficult. And this will inevitably drive us to cut the middleman and to streamline the processes and to be much more efficient in the way we go from our factories, from the origin of the products to the consumer. Reduce inventory, working capital, advertising expenditures, sales force structures, logistics, warehousing, waste. At the end, and one more thing is that technology help us now more than ever to streamline the feedback loop between what consumer needs and what we are able or capable to deliver to the consumer. Also, technology is empowering consumers more than ever and giving them price transparency, personalization, peer reviewings. So it's more informed and knowledgeable than ever before. And in the 5 years, until at least from these latitudes in South America, we are seeing an incredible shift behaviors towards e-commerce and convenience. Convenience is saving time and money are becoming more and more important from our standpoint. So one question I always ask to myself, I have 2 kids, one is 14, the other 15, and how they behave, how they interact, how they educate, how they consume, how they entertain is completely different, not from myself, but from my daughter, but from my sister that is 15 years earlier than me. So it's a huge gap there. And I cannot imagine then when in the future they got married, have children, spending time driving through, taking his car, going out to a supermarket, surfing a huge retailer with 10,000 SKUs just to buy 30, 40 items for their needs. And then spend time and maybe paying a little bit more than they can do it online today. So all these structures maybe have to be rethinked. I think this business model are need to reshape. Just one fact that from it's astonishing, in this year, 2018, only in the US, 12,000 retail stores are about to close. It just started. And this means, from my point of view, is the end of retail? No, definitely not. But I think we are in a pivoting momentum where every retailer needs to really rethink their reason why, which is the need or the necessity that they are fulfilling, and if how they are fulfilling is the right way they're doing. I have become a fan of another disruption that is going on, that these are the direct-to-consumer brands. These brands that understand a clear market need, and they deliver an amazing product, and at the same time they're fulfilling convenience, time saving, and saving money to consumers. So going back to the basics and try to fulfill these necessities, from my point of view, it's very, very important. I mentioned before, speed in every process is more than ever a key advantage. Speed in research and development, in marketing, in sales, in manufacturing, in understanding, in customer service, understanding the consumer and its changes. And to end my reflection, I see two huge areas of opportunity in the value chain. That is the fulfillment process and last mile logistics. That are two main processes that are really present tremendous areas of opportunity and innovations, and the companies that really tackle that problem will have a competitive advantage there.
Thanks, Adolfo. Juan?
I have a couple of comments regarding the question that you raised. From the upstream perspective, the right usage of resources is critical. What I referred before about the 30% of waste is a big question mark that needs to be addressed really fast, because it's not sustainable. Today, maybe we have the capacity of wasting 30%, but it's not something that can be projected anymore for the future. So that's the key question. From the downstream perspective, yes, there are a lot of benefits from the technology, the simplification, the road to market, the road to consumer. We are making things much easier, faster, and much more tailor-made to any consumers. But at the end of the day, there are some changes that need to happen in order to ensure that we have a role into the society, which is to give health through the food, which is something that is not fully complete today. We are feeding, we are not bringing the right health, like clean labels, simple recipes, better use of ingredients, not using some ingredients, which is, in some way I'm reflecting this in a behaviors that the company need to do in order to ensure that they are sustainable for the future. So I would say these two fronts, from the upstream, the usage, and from the downstream, the responsibility of being good citizens to give health to the food that we are delivering.
Thank you, Juan.
Santiago, I guess I have a couple of examples that come to mind that I'm aware of. So IBM and Maersk did this experiment, if you will, of moving cut flowers from Kenya to Europe. And they applied blockchain technology. And what that does is, apparently there were 200 paper documents that had to be checked, and checked actually multiple times by the same people sometimes, to make that journey. And so, and in fact, another example is in Colombia, where we do a lot of work with the Orinoco region, et cetera. Every transport vehicle that carries coffee from the co-ops to the ports has GPS trackers today. And what does that tell them? It tells them that if some truck is taking too long on the road somewhere, it tells you one thing, that the drug trafficking, et cetera, isn't happening through the coffee thing, coffee transport. But it also sort of goes to the provenance of the coffee isn't left in jute bags in humid climates, and therefore it's not spoiled. And so just two examples of where I think blockchain has, again, these are all fads in some ways, and yet there's so much application to simplifying processes, to improving nutrition in many ways as a result of this, today at least the biggest growth area in the US is in sort of organic, locally sourced, non-GMO, whatever you want to call it. And so I think in terms of labeling these things and being able to provide access is critical. And therefore, I think my sense is that, Juan said this earlier, that it's the entire supply chain that has to be looked at holistically, and every aspect of it is ripe for innovation. So, for example, there's no one-size-fits-all, like I said before. The type of agriculture is based on the environment in the region. It's based on the interest in technology adoption, which varies from area to area. The literacy. We don't talk about education, but literacy is a huge determinant. The political climate, the willingness to change, right? The market opportunities, all these things are critical in succeeding in any of these things. And I think unless we look at the entire supply chain and look for areas at every level for innovation, this so-called revolution would not happen.
Thank you, Suresh. Paul.
So, when we were getting ready for this panel session, we said it would be great if there was enormous tension and argument between us, right? Much more entertaining, right?
I don't like you, Paul.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're mean. Yeah, that's right. There you go. There's our tension. There is, I think, a lot of agreement around. That's what you're seeing, right? You're seeing a lot of agreement around what's needed. And I want to talk a little bit about data, to pick up on your point about data and the importance of data. We talk about digitisation often, in other sectors, but not very often in food. But one of the tensions I want to pick up on is increasing wealth and what that means for food. So it was a point that you made, actually, Rafiq, which was that how do you access, or one of the things we know about increasing wealth is that you want to access protein, right? You want to eat meat. This is the country of red meat. You want to eat more red meat. So we need to start thinking not so much about how we deliver more red meat, but how do we deliver protein? Right, so there are technologies that allow you to isolate the proteins and deliver them through forms like snacking. Right, so that was a great point that you were making about how do you pick up, how do you deliver existing food experiences in different ways. And to your point about so to finish that point, there is this tension that we're going to have to manage. Increasing wealth, that means that cost will be for things like a piece of steak on a plate suddenly becomes perhaps a premium item. It doesn't become something that is accessible. So maybe people get access to because it's not sustainable over time, right? We know that. Or there might be mechanisms and technologies where rather than actually having access to protein in a traditional supply chain, farmed, in quantity and grow a whole animal in order to supply a piece of steak, that perhaps, there are technologies already where you take a biopsy of the animal and then you're able to grow equally good meat or fish, sources of protein in a lab. So I think those technologies are very interesting to look at. But then I go back to what I said at the beginning, which is, and it's a point that Juan made about waste, right? We can do an enormous amount on waste, and we have to do a lot more education on waste. So I'll give you a quick example of this. So we worked with a company that produced, in fact it was a small startup of ours, that produced a ripeness indicator on fruits and vegetables. And there was an enormous resistance from the industry. Why? Because they didn't want a banana that looked a perfectly good banana and the consumer being told it might be overripe. It might go overripe in the next day or two, right? So we need to educate a consumer. We need to educate the consumer that, in fact, those things that tell you something about the food are good things, and that, a just-in-time arrangement where you receive something that might go overripe in a couple of days means that you have to change your behaviours. So I think there's an education piece. And then finally, on the data, it's a great point about using technology on simple things like tracking vehicles, particularly in the protein space where someone will stop, a refrigerator stops on a truck, and you then have spoilage or quality issues, which then affect the trust chain for consumers.
We run out of time. We do have some questions, most of them related to how technology can negatively affect production. But let me close here. You know that on the afternoon we would have breakout sessions on food, which would be led by many of the guys who are here. So I invite you to be there and follow up that conversation later on. But just as a closing remark, obviously, in my view, we are in front of the fourth revolution, not only on the production sector, but most importantly on the whole value chain, right? Applying technology, data, blockchain. Also trying to address the issue of retail, which once we take retail out of the question, probably in a separate session, you mentioned like the cost of producing 1 peso of food, then the consumer would have to pay 4 pesos of that, right? And eventually, everything boils down to educate the consumer of which are not the most nutritional foods, right? Because the consumer is a little detached from brands. Yeah, you mentioned like 50% of people in UK do not connect cows with butter, right? They wouldn't know that butter is coming from cows, and you have you really want to provide better brands about that, right? And you're working hard on that. So thank you so much for participating in this panel. It has been extremely exciting. We would let you stay out of the stage, and then we follow with Diego. Thank you so much. Thank you.